Hi, I'm Jim May. I'm the Northglenn Police Chief, and I have a special guest with me today, actually a longtime friend, our District Attorney, Brian Mason. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Chief. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah. So go ahead and why don't you tell our community about you and how long you worked for Adams County, and then, you know, the courage of taking on that district attorney job.
Oh, thank you. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be in Northglenn. I love Northglenn. You have a terrific department, and I love working with you and working with your team.
Yeah.
My name's Brian Mason. I'm the district attorney for Colorado's 17th Judicial District. In Colorado, we have 22 judicial districts. We're about to have 23, actually, starting next year. And judicial districts are drawn along county lines. So the 17th Judicial District includes all of Adams and Broomfield counties. And the district attorney is the chief law enforcement officer for that judicial district, for that jurisdiction. And it's my role as a district attorney to prosecute crime, to keep the community safe, and to make the criminal justice system better. So that's my goal. As for me personally, I'm from Colorado. I grew up in Aurora. Then my family moved across town when I was in 8th grade, so I went to Heritage High School in Littleton. I went to college on the East Coast and then worked in DC for 4 years right after college, and then came home to Colorado. I went to law school at University of Colorado, and I joined the DA's office in 2006. So I've been at the DA's office now for 17 and a half years. I grew up in the office, started out as a young lawyer prosecuting DUI cases and low-level domestic violence cases, and then moved up through the ranks of the DA's office to working on felony cases, and then was made a supervisor. And in 2019 and 2020, I decided to run for the top job. And the district attorney is an elected position, so it's something that you have to campaign for and have the voters decide. But I was elected in 2020, and I took office in 2021.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. You know, I appreciate you and your
Likewise.
team. We do a lot together, right? So when you know, not only, you know, with our investigations team, working, you know, with your team of prosecutors and filing cases, a lot going on in the community, and some of those high impact stuff that's really has affected public safety in our community. And one big topic that I want to cover with you, because just recently we ended up recovering over 500 fentanyl pills within the last week.
Yeah.
Right. So if you want to just talk about that and some of the great things that, you know, we're trying to impact, but, you know, things that your office is doing to combat that as well.
So the DA's office at any given time has an enormous caseload. And right now we have probably 30,000 cases in our office. And that's anything from a DUI case or a traffic case to first-degree murder. So it's really an enormous job. And I have 238 employees, from attorneys to investigators to victim advocates, all of whom work on that huge caseload of cases to try to make victims whole. And one of the hardest things confronting our community right now, as you well know, is the opioid crisis. And fentanyl is at the top of that list. So fentanyl is without question the most dangerous drug on the streets. Fentanyl is literally killing our kids. And so every time I have the opportunity to speak publicly, I tell parents, you have to talk to your kids about fentanyl. When I first took office, so this was 3.5 years ago, although the fentanyl crisis was well underway, we were really at a point where the drug cartels and drug dealers were mixing fentanyl into other drugs. And so the danger, which remains but has changed, and I'll talk about that, the danger then was kids, teenagers, college kids, folks in their 20s, taking an oxy pill thinking that it was oxy, but it was laced with fentanyl. And people were dying because of it. And here in Adams County, as you may recall, we had 5 people die in Commerce City, in one of your neighboring municipalities. We had 5 people die in Commerce City in one incident from what I call fentanyl poisoning. They were taking cocaine. They thought they were taking cocaine. And it was in fact laced with fentanyl, and it killed all 5 of them. And so that frightens me, and it should frighten anybody. There is a strategy, though, that I have learned in this job that the cartels were using, and that is they were lacing other drugs with fentanyl to get addicts addicted to fentanyl, not just to their original drug of choice. And so now we see more and more people who aren't purchasing their original drug of choice, they're purchasing fentanyl itself because they're addicted to it. And fentanyl is cheap for the cartels to make, and it is probably the most highly addictive drug out there. If not the highest, it's certainly one of them. And so it's flooded our community. It's flooded every community in the United States. And the question is, what do we do about it? And that's an area of collaboration between the DA's office and the Northglenn Police Department and all of the departments that I work with. But it's a real struggle because there are more drugs out there than we have resources to stop. What do we specifically work on at the DA's office? Well, we have, first of all, we're part of the North Metro Task Force, of which Northglenn is also a part. And their job, and one of their primary goals, is to go after the big fish. And when I took office, that was one of the things I said. I have enormous empathy, as I know you do, Chief, for folks who struggle with addiction. And we can't prosecute our way out of this problem. We can't lock everybody up who is an addict. On the contrary, folks who are addicts need help, and they need resources, and they need services. However, I take a very different approach to dealers. So folks who are dealing these drugs in our community deserve to be held accountable, and we bring the hammer down on them, and that's what we've done. And so working with the North Metro Task Force, we've taken down some major drug rings here in Adams and Broomfield counties, and we're prosecuting those folks.
I know sometimes it's difficult to get the dealer of the ones that actually dealt the actual fentanyl that ended up actually killing somebody, right? But with the state law that, recently that, was changed in the last, couple of years, or was it last year? I can't remember exactly, but that changed. So how are those cases coming into you, and what can we do as a police department to assist you on those prosecution of some of those cases?
Yeah, great question. So when the 5 people in Commerce City died in February of 2022, we did not have a law on the books in the state of Colorado that empowered me as the DA to charge and hold accountable the person who dealt that fentanyl for the deaths of those 5 people. So we had distribution counts, and of course we had first-degree murder, but there are specific elements of first-degree murder that I am required to prove. That means I have to prove that whoever committed the murder deliberated, that it showed it was after deliberation with intent, and in other words, intentionally killed somebody. Well, drug dealers don't intentionally kill their clients. That would be against their self-interest. They want their clients to continue to buy their drugs. And so the first-degree murder statute didn't really cover the crime of distributing a drug that then led to somebody's death, particularly with regards to fentanyl. So I advocated at the state legislature, and I know you did, and many of our colleagues did, to change the law. And the Colorado legislature heard us, and we worked really hard on it. And now there is a law in the books that's called distribution of fentanyl causing death. So this now allows me to charge someone who has distributed fentanyl, and then somebody who they distribute it to used the fentanyl and died, it allows me to charge them and hold them accountable. Now that sounds great, and we worked hard to get that law changed. But I will tell you, those cases are enormously hard to investigate and to prosecute and to secure convictions on. And as you know, with your team here who investigates these cases, when somebody dies from an overdose or from fentanyl poisoning, figuring out who they got the drugs from is very tricky. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's a trail. Sometimes we can look at their text messages. Sometimes we can look at their social media accounts. But the social media today is so sophisticated, as you know, that many trails of text messages, what I still call text messages, are automatically deleted after they get used. So I wish I could say that this law has made a huge impact. I think it is still yet to be determined how big the impact will be, because these cases are hard to file and hard to actually investigate.
No, thank you for that. I think that was an excellent explanation. I think the public would see that because they do hear it in the news all the time.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to move to, just talk about a little bit, property crime, right? So we've seen, where our motor vehicle thefts were incredibly high.
Yeah.
We have seen a reduction, but really some of the violent crime and everything else, and gun crime, especially with youth. I'm throwing a bunch of questions at you at once, but I know you can handle it. But yeah, just talk about that. Some of the things that I think we're doing a better job on. Out there in patrol, we're using technology for us, to combat a lot of the property crime, and we have seen some reductions, especially in 24. But I know the motor vehicle theft, and it really impacted our community, right?
It's huge.
And again, you helped at the state legislation level as well, because it was, and I've been saying that for years too, when they changed the values of a felony and misdemeanor.
Yeah.
But I don't want to steal your thunder.
Not at
I'm
all.
going to turn that back over to you. But some things you did with that, and
Sure.
what your office is seeing on property crime and motor vehicle theft.
Yeah, and you asked a bunch of good questions in there, and I hope we'll get back to youth violent crime in a minute, because that's an important topic. But on property crimes and motor vehicle theft, for a time, the state of Colorado had the unenviable distinction of having the highest number of motor vehicle thefts per capita of any state in the United States. So thieves were stealing cars across Colorado in enormously high numbers, and we weren't successfully figuring out those cases and getting those cases resolved and holding those folks accountable. And so we really dug into why. Why is that? Why does Colorado have such a high number of motor vehicle thefts? And my conclusion is one that you shared with me. We shared the same conclusion, that is the law was not strong enough. Mm-hmm. So prior to the advocacy that we did to get that law changed, in the state of Colorado, the level of crime for motor vehicle theft depended on the value of the car. So that meant if somebody stole a BMW or a 2022 Tesla, we could charge them with a felony. But if they stole a 2005 Honda Accord, it was a misdemeanor offense. And who typically drives a older car? It's people without means to buy the 2020 Tesla. Mm-hmm. And those folks suffered when their cars were stolen. Anybody who has a car stolen suffers, but the ones who suffered the most were the ones who couldn't go buy another car, and then they couldn't get to work, or they couldn't get their kids to daycare or to school, or they couldn't get to a grocery store to get their groceries. And it was just inequitable. It was an inequity in the law. And motor vehicle thieves were exploiting it. So we had folks who were getting, when we could solve the crimes, tagged with a misdemeanor, and they would literally get arrested, get their misdemeanor summons, go out and steal another car. So we had to change the law, and we did. Now any motor vehicle theft in the state of Colorado is a felony. It's not dependent on value of the car. And our rates have gone down somewhat dramatically, I would say. I mean, we've really been able to make progress on this challenge. There are still too many cars that are being stolen, but we have the tools now that we didn't have before to really go after them.
And I think from our side, it was easier for us to, because the change in the law as well, for making more prosecutable, right?
Yes.
So I think those changes, to that as well, assisted us, and we can hold them accountable.
100%.
That's the big thing that, from the police officer side, we were like, hey, we're getting these, and we saw the same thing, right? We'd take him down, get him processed at the jail. They'd be out a couple, hours later, and we'd catch him in another stolen car.
Right.
Right. So, and it's frustrating when you're out there doing the hard work, because it's not, it's not like it is on TV where you make it a arrest and it's done, right? There's a lot of paperwork and everything else. So when this keeps going, it takes a lot of time on the officer's part. So when we're seeing those reductions in those motor vehicle theft, we're able to use resources in other places as well that we need them.
Exactly. And there are nuances in the law, right? And sometimes people say, well, why does the state legislature pass new laws? We have plenty already. Well, sometimes there are laws that need to be upgraded or need to be adjusted. And the motor vehicle theft statute was one of them. We talked about the value. The other issue in the law previously was the mental state element. Yeah. So this gets a little wonky and lawyerly, but when I have to take a case to trial, every crime in the state of Colorado has two main components. One is the act itself, and two is the mental state of the person who has committed the act. I'm required to prove that a person who has committed a crime knew what they were doing, that they weren't forced into it, or that they weren't under duress, or that they weren't perhaps intoxicated. That's not true for all crimes, of course. If you commit a crime while you're intoxicated, it's not a blanket get out of jail free card. But what was happening with motor vehicle theft is we had to prove that the suspect knew the car that they were in was stolen. And that may seem obvious, right? If they're in a stolen car, of course they knew it. But motor vehicle theft has become far more advanced than it used to be, because our cars are more advanced. So the days of seeing a screwdriver in the ignition slot or a shaved ignition are mostly over, because our cars don't use those things anymore. Our cars have fobs and turn on with buttons. And so we were having cases that your team were arresting folks on, and then the defendants were saying, oh, well, I borrowed this car from my friend Joey. I didn't know this was stolen. And it was not a believable story, but juries were struggling. So we would put these cases in front of juries, and their defense would be, my client didn't know that this was a stolen car, and juries were acquitting. And so we needed to have some more teeth there. And so we made a very small but nuanced change, which is now we have to prove that a suspect of a motor vehicle theft knew or should have known that the car was stolen. And that, again, has dramatically helped us in prosecuting these cases.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that's helped us as well, right? So especially it makes the officers work harder out there, because they know they're going to hold that individual accountable. And I don't know if that's everything that has reduced the numbers of motor vehicle theft, but it surely helped. Yeah. And then it's the same with your office on the prosecution of that. So, and getting them off the streets is really important. Yeah. And we'll keep, doing that and see if we can do more reduction on that. Yeah. Front.
I'll add one more thing on this topic. The other challenge that we sometimes have is convincing judges to take these cases seriously. So as the district attorney, my job is to file cases. We make the decisions on charges. We prosecute the cases. We try to resolve cases when it's appropriate, and when it's not, we take these cases to trial. But after there is a conviction, the person who determines the sentence is not the DA. And lots of people think that I decide what a person's sentence is going to be. That's not true. Sometimes we have influence over it when there's a resolution to the case, but ultimately the decision on what a sentence will be is made by the judge. That's the role of our judicial process. And judges historically took persons' crimes, so when somebody is hurt by another human being, whether that's a strangulation or a fight or a gunshot wound, they took persons' crimes far more seriously than what were traditionally referred to as property crimes. And that included motor vehicle theft. So a lot of defendants who we worked hard to investigate these cases and then secure convictions were still being given a slap on the wrist by our judges. So we've also worked on educating the bench, the judicial bench, on why these cases are actually very serious. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier. When someone's car is stolen and you can't afford another one, it dramatically impacts your life.
Well, you remind me of something else that we see so often, right? That motor vehicle theft is linked to other crimes.
100%.
Right? Robberies,
yes,
drug offenses, drive-by shootings,
yeah,
right? So that violence and everything else, so we see that. And I think that's why most agencies don't have chase policies anymore. So when we see a stolen car, we don't know it's just a stolen car.
Yeah.
There could be other things going on in that vehicle that we don't know about.
Right.
But for the safety of the community, we have no chase policies. But how do we get that individual? So what we implemented, which you've heard about, is our flock camera system.
Right.
Where it's a license plate reader, where we get hits. So in our city, if those vehicles come in, we get hits of stolen vehicles or people with warrants and everything else. So it immediately notifies the officers working of that vehicle. So a lot of times we've seen it where officers are able to put that car to rest, right? And then take that individual into custody in a safe manner.
Right.
And so we've seen a huge increase over this year of those hits and arrests, and then setting them up to your office. So, but that's another thing too. Is there's just that interlink between that. But the other thing that we're seeing too that really want to talk about is that youth violence and the guns. And how that has for the last couple of years. We've seen just a huge increase with drive-by shootings and that with our young people and the availability of some of these firearms, and just you talked about a little bit on social media on how they're trading these guns. We've had Neighbors hits with these guns that are used all over the Denver metro area.
Yeah.
So I just get your opinion and your thoughts on that topic.
It's a hugely important topic. Overall, despite what people may think, right now across the state, crime is down. So our numbers are down, which is a good thing. But juvenile violent crime is not. Juvenile violent crime is up. And this quite literally, Chief, keeps me up at night. So I get called on every single homicide in my jurisdiction. So every time there's a murder, I get notified. And as you know, the vast majority of murders and homicides happen after midnight.
Yeah.
So I get woken up a lot over the course of any given year or any given week or month. And kids today, and I don't mean that to sound quite as general as as I'm starting this, but kids today fight about things that kids have fought about for time immemorial. Mm-hmm. They fight about girls. They fight about clothes. They fight about
territory,
all those things. Mm-hmm. The difference is they are bringing guns to those fights in ways that we've never seen before. I have, in my time as the district attorney, I said earlier we have 30,000 cases in the office. I don't make every decision on every one of those cases. That would be impossible. And that's why I have such a great team. But I make all the decisions on homicide cases. So I make the decisions what charges to file and how those cases are going to proceed. I have filed homicide charges in my time as the DA on cases that the homicide occurred because of a fight over a purse. I have filed a homicide case where the shooting occurred because of an argument about a girl. I have filed a homicide case where the disagreement was over a pair of jeans. So these are things that, again, kids have fought over for time immemorial. They just used to fight with their fists, and now they're bringing firearms. And it's a huge public policy and public safety crisis. And as you indicated, the proliferation of guns amongst young people is just a huge problem. And a vast majority of these guns are stolen, and they're getting handed around, and they're getting sold on social media. And it's leading to tragic deaths of kids whose lives are being cut way too short.
Yeah. And again, those stolen guns that are getting out on the street. So in Northglenn, we've had a program for quite a while for safe storage where we give rebates to our residents if they buy a safe, right?
Yeah.
So it's 25% up to $500. That, because it is so important to be as responsible as you can to make sure you safely secure your firearms is important.
Yeah.
So, but we have that program here in Northglenn that's been going on for probably almost 10 years now.
Yeah,
so
that's so important.
Yeah, so it's, and also for safety of children too, because so many kids are accidentally shot by a firearm as well.
Yeah.
And you see those cases once in a while coming into your office.
We do, and gun safety is so critical. And I don't know a single gun owner who doesn't care about gun safety. But unfortunately, not every gun owner prioritizes that in their own homes. And that can lead to kids getting access to guns that the owners clearly don't mean or have any desire to see happen, and then tragedies occur as a result. So it's so important if you own a gun to make sure you have a secure place for it, that it's locked up, and that kids can't access them.
Yeah. And then, again, accountability and responsibility as parents, right?
Yeah.
And as a parent too, my kids are old. I actually have grandbabies now, which is another stress.
You don't look old enough to have grandbabies, Chief.
I have 3. So, but that's the other thing too. Parents sometimes, if they're having problems with their kids, or at school, or the kids are going through some challenges and trauma and everything else, as a parent, you still have the responsibility, and you still can, they ask, well, what can I do? And especially, last thing you want to do is, if you're seeing personality changes with your kids, get them help. There's plenty of help that we have, just reach out and we can guide you to help those individuals. But also as a parent, sometimes if your kid's been getting in trouble and everything else, you don't want them to escalate to that next level, right? So, going in, checking their rooms, checking that, stuff, especially if anger, checking their social media, because, our job as parents is protecting our kids, right? But it's not ignoring behaviors that can cause problems in the community. So please take that initiative and really talk to your kids. And if your kids need help, please reach out so we can provide some resources and everything else that you can get.
I'll add something to that, Chief, too. I said earlier that kids are fighting about things that they've always fought about. But now they bring weapons to these fights. But the other component of this, it's easy for us to say kids these days are different than when we were kids. Well, kids are facing challenges these days that we never had to face, and that's specifically with regards to social media. Social media has some obvious benefits, but there's a lot of cons and a lot of dangers of social media, and it puts enormous pressure on young people. And the mental health crisis that we face in this country is driven in many ways by social media. So when we talk about gun crime, certainly violent crime is a huge problem, but our suicide rates are also a huge problem, particularly among young people. And that's another reason why it's so important to make sure that our guns are properly stored. I read just this week, actually, this is a little bit off topic, but that people in the military now are more likely to die of suicide than they are to die in combat. That's a staggering statistic to me, and another example of just how much of a problem mental health is and why we have to continue to address it.
Yeah, and if people are out there struggling today and watching this, again, we have resources and everything else to help, because you're not the only ones going through those thoughts and those processes, right? So you're not alone, and and just realizing that there is help, there are better days ahead, I think is very important. So take care of yourself, reach out, and let someone else help you and take care of you, through those times. So.
Struggling with mental health is super common. Jim, in this line of work, that we see things we cannot unsee. And I had to go to a really bad homicide scene a couple years ago before I was the district attorney. And it impacted me in such a way that I was struggling. And I needed help. And so I went out and got it. But it is hard to talk about those things, and we don't like to admit that we may need help. And because we don't like to admit it, sometimes folks don't get the help that they need, and then they spiral downwards. So it's important to break the stigma. It's why I freely tell people that I needed to get help back then, and I'm so glad that I did. And I hope that other people will feel that they can do that too.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Well, we're hitting a bunch of different topics, but there's some other things, exciting things happening in our county right now.
There
and
are.
Actually, and you're the lead on it with the Family Justice Center. So
Yeah.
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of giving everybody an overview of what the Family Justice Center is.
Sure.
And what your goals are over the next couple of years.
I'm so glad you asked. It's one of my favorite topics because I think a Family Justice Center is going to dramatically impact how we serve victims in this jurisdiction. So domestic violence, of course, is a huge problem, and it was exacerbated during the pandemic. Our domestic violence numbers went up, and certainly when people were forced to stay home and couldn't get out the way that we normally did, that raises tensions and can lead to issues that didn't already exist. And so when I took office, one of the things that I said to my team was I want to be innovative about how we address the problem of domestic violence. And one of the biggest challenges for victims of domestic violence is getting the help and the resources that they need in order to make the right decisions for them and for their families. And many victims cannot leave their abusers because they don't have access to the help that they need. So we have thousands of domestic violence cases in our office every year. And when I first started out as a young DA right out of law school, I would ask myself, and other people would ask me, well, why do these victims stay? Why don't they just get out? And the answer is they're stuck because they may be reliant on their abuser financially, or they may be reliant on their abuser to support their kids, or their abuser may have control of the car keys, or their abuser may have control of the bank accounts or the mortgage or whatever it may be. So there's all kinds of barriers for a victim. And we've done the math on this. A standard victim of domestic violence has to drive 300 miles just here in Adams County. So a victim in Northglenn would have to drive over the course of several days 300 miles to get all of the services that she or he needs. And I say she first because the majority of our domestic violence victims are women. Of course, it can happen to men as well. And that is such a barrier to those folks getting out. And where are they going? Well, they may have to go to the courthouse. They may have to go to the police department. They may have to go to child welfare or to human services. They may need help with family law. So they may need access to somebody to help them with a divorce or with a separation. They may need help with childcare. And all of these things are in disparate, separate areas of the county. So a family justice center, the beauty of a family justice center model is that we put all of these services under one roof, all of them, so that a victim of domestic violence or of sexual assault or of elder abuse, we're hoping to include all of those, can walk in the door and get all the services that they need in one place. The most dangerous time, the most lethal time for a victim of domestic violence is when they're trying to get out. And in every jurisdiction in this country that has a family justice center, this is a huge statistic. In every jurisdiction that has a family justice center, domestic violence fatalities have gone down.
It's huge.
Because when a victim can walk into a family justice center and get all of the services that they need in one place and be protected, they can separate from their abuser safely. So we're leading an effort to create and build a family justice center here in Adams and Broomfield counties. And we've had a ton of progress in the last couple months, and we're having, as you indicated, a big strategic planning meeting later this month in June, and I'm excited about it. It's a big project. We're probably going to need to build a new building from the ground up, and that's expensive. So we have to work on funding, and we have to collaborate with all of these different agencies and nonprofits and law enforcement partners to make sure we have all the right people to be part of this. But it's an exciting process, and one that, if we succeed, I think will have an enormous impact on public safety in this community.
Yeah, and this county's not unfamiliar with coming together and building things, right? One of the things that's near and dear to my heart is our Child Advocacy Center and the Ralston House.
Yes.
And we saw the same effort, and when we all got together and said, this has to happen.
That's right.
Right? And
that's in Northglenn now.
Yeah, and you never hoping you never have to use it. Unfortunately, it's used way too much.
Yeah.
And the other thing, Brian, we talked about the Family Justice Center, right? Things that come to mind. A lot of this is not reported.
Yeah.
There's, we see a lot of cases, but you probably know the stat on how many are not reported.
Yes.
That we really need, because some don't want police involvement,
right?
But they still need those services.
Correct.
So I think that's another incredibly important thing with this, the Family Justice Center.
That's exactly right. And I'll just add to that when we're successful, I'm going to be optimistic and say when we're able to open our doors to a Family Justice Center, this will be a place where a victim of domestic violence can come and get the services they need, regardless of whether or not they report the crime. There will not be a requirement that they cooperate with law enforcement. There will not be a obligation to be a part of a prosecution. That is totally unrelated. What the Family Justice Center will do is give them the services that they need so that they can be safe. And that's going to save lives.
Yeah. And also, for those that, don't speak English, it's not their first, language, right? And having that availability too, coming in and having someone that speaks their language. We've seen a lot of immigrants come in to our communities. We have a mosque here in our community with a lot of Afghanistan refugees and everything else. So having that ability for them and a resource is huge. And I think that's very important too.
I agree.
So
I agree.
All right. So just some other things that I think, is there anything that you have that you would like to talk about?
We covered a lot of ground. There's one topic I want to go back to just briefly,
Okay.
and do a little bit of advocating for your listeners on the subject of juvenile violence and juvenile violent crime. People ask me, well, you're the DA, what are you doing about it? And the answer is we're doing a lot. We're working with the Northglenn Police Department, and we're working with all of our partners in Adams and Broomfield counties to investigate and hold these folks accountable for violent crime, youth violent crime in particular. But there's one element of state law right now that is hurting my ability to hold violent youth accountable for their actions. And that is what we call the bed cap. So what do I mean by that? When a person who's under 18 commits a violent crime, shoots somebody, commits a murder or a sex assault or an aggravated robbery, police, of course, investigate, and when they have probable cause, will make an arrest, and we seek to hold those folks in custody. But under Colorado law, we have what I would call an arbitrary cap on the number of beds in the state of Colorado for holding violent young suspects. In this jurisdiction, I am limited to 18 beds. We have close to 700,000 people in my community, in Adams and Broomfield combined. And we have more than 18 violent youth. And so my team, along with other stakeholders, on a weekly and sometimes daily basis, have to decide which least dangerous young person to release from one of these beds, because last night another young person committed a murder and we need to create a bed for them. That is not good public policy. That is not good for public safety. And it arbitrarily handcuffs those of us in law enforcement who are trying to keep the community safe. So I've advocated at the legislature for this to change. So far we haven't succeeded, but I want the public to know about it because most don't. And when I get to talk about this in public settings or town halls, most are pretty outraged about it. I don't like locking up kids, nor is that my goal. But there are some violent youth who are so dangerous or who have committed such a violent crime that the only safe place for them and for the community is for us to have them be detained. And when we can't do that, it puts the community at risk. We have parents, God bless them, who have worked hard with their troubled kid and don't have the skills to do it. And they don't want to take that kid back into the home after they've committed a violent crime. They don't have the resources to take care of them. And so what happens when these kids get released is they can't just go back to a loving home. They're out on the streets, and then they're more likely to commit another violent crime. So I put that on the public's radar because, again, I don't want, nor do I take any joy in locking up kids. But we need to have more flexibility to detain and keep in custody the most violent youth who are committing the most violent crimes.
Yeah, that always frustrated me as well. It's picked a number, right?
Right.
And then, because we've had cases that, we can't get bed space for them.
Right.
Right. So, but no, that would be fantastic. And especially if, public put pressure on their legislators and everything else, like we do, right?
Yeah.
We talk to them, call them out and say, hey, we need to, try to solve the problem that we're seeing.
Right.
So, no, thank you. And another thing when it comes to juvenile, the Youth Resource Advocacy Center.
Yeah.
So I know you're very instrumental in that as well.
Yeah.
We haven't had a program, for what, over a year?
It's been over a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to have a organization called The Link. The Link was our juvenile assessment center, and they had some financial problems, and they had to shut down. And so for over a year now, we haven't had what's typically called the JAC, Juvenile Assessment Center, that provides resources to kids who are having troubles. And that's another thing that we're working hard on to try to stand up a new one.
Yeah, and with the increase of the violent crime and the youth stuff, and again, it starts off, so having that resource again for parents, schools, and officers, where we have a place to take to help them, because not every kid is the same. They need different resources of where they're at.
Right.
And I think, programs like this helps that. And then, and I believe more successful in, deterring and making sure that reduce that, youth crime in our communities.
Agreed.
So,
Agreed.
But Brian, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, for coming in today and meeting with me. Great conversations. Hopefully we can do this again.
I'd love to.
In the future, and just, get some updates on some of the great things that your office is doing with, especially, again, you have a lot of jurisdictions, but I've seen you here, after midnight, in my police department. Maybe one last thing to talk about.
Sure.
Again, over the last several years, police accountability and everything else. And
Yeah.
One thing in our county, we've had a critical incident team.
Yes.
And you're in charge of that team.
Yeah.
So if you can, again, if one of our officers are involved in a shooting, we really have nothing to do with it, right?
Right.
So if you can just, talk about your critical incident team.
Sure.
And just educate the public a little bit on what the purpose and for you to
Yeah.
and the ultimate decision of not to charge
Right.
an officer for the use of deadly force.
Right. So we don't ever want an officer to have to use his or her weapon, and we don't ever want somebody to get shot and killed in an encounter with police. But it does happen. And when it happens, the state of Colorado has mandated that there be an independent investigation. So that means if, in the unfortunate circumstance, a Northglenn police officer uses his weapon or her weapon and kills somebody, so uses deadly force, you as the Northglenn Police Department don't investigate it yourself, because there's an inherent conflict there.
Yeah.
There just is. You can't be objective when you're reviewing the actions of one of your own officers on something of this magnitude. And so we have what's called the Critical Incident Response Team, and often referred to as the CIRT team or the SHOOT team. And the CIRT team is made up of all of the agencies within the 17th Judicial District, so within Adams and Broomfield counties. And when there is a deadly force incident, the department that has the officer who used deadly force completely is separated from the investigation. And this independent team performs a complete investigation of what happened. And it is officially a criminal investigation. It is an investigation to determine whether or not the deadly force that was used was appropriate and justified under the law. And that team goes out, and these, again, typically happen late at night or sometimes in the early morning hours after midnight. But the entire team responds. I often respond to those scenes personally, and we complete an investigation. And that investigation takes a long time because it has to be thorough. And then the team presents the results of their investigation to me and to my office. And then I am legally then required to make a decision as to whether or not the use of deadly force was justified or was not justified. And if I determine that it was not justified, then I charge the officer with a criminal offense. If I determine that the actions were justified, then I state that as well and exonerate the officer from criminal liability by saying we're not going to charge this person. Police departments can then do their own internal investigations to determine whether or not regular policies were followed, or if there are any other issues. But that's, in terms of the criminal investigation, that's my job. And it's those are challenging cases. but important ones. And I'm proud of our CIRT team. I'm proud of the work that they do, and I'm proud of the transparency that we value and prioritize. So we put it all out there. I will write a very lengthy letter that details the whole investigation. We release the body cams. We release summaries of interviews so that the public can scrutinize our work and scrutinize my decision. But that's how that works, and it's a complicated process, but ultimately one that I think protects the integrity of these investigations and makes sure that police officers are, when necessary, held accountable for criminal conduct, but on the other hand, given the support they need when they have done the right thing in a difficult situation, and they hear from me, you did the right thing. This was a justified action.
No, thank you for that. All right, with that, I appreciate you coming in.
Thank you,
again,
Jim.
Thank you
I'll
so
say
much.
one more thing as we're wrapping up. I had the opportunity to be at a community meeting with you not too long ago, and the love that this community has for you and this department is amazing to me. And you have had such an impressive career. And honestly, I work with a lot of police chiefs and I love them all. But you're a rare commodity in that you have been in Northglenn 30 years?
32 years.
32 years. So at that community meeting, we had people coming up saying, you were my school resource officer 20 years ago or however long ago. And that's a pretty unique thing. So thank you for your service to Northglenn.
No,
You've had a real impact.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that. With that, thank you so much for tuning in. A lot of information. I'll definitely have Brian back, not just for my ego, but because he has a lot of great information and we want to keep you guys informed. So thanks again for tuning in.